George, oops, sorry. So I'm Bob Wartung, a professor of sustainability and international affairs at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and working with Mike Jones, who's an economist at the University of Alaska Anchorage. Um, we're very happy to present another Bob today, Bob Loeffler. And Bob has more than 40 years experience working on resource issues, much of which is focused on mining. He has a master's degree in civil engineering from Stanford University and a master's degree in regional planning from Harvard University. And for the last 16 years, he has been a research professor of public policy at the University of Alaska's Institute of Social and Economic Research. And there at ICER, his research focuses on natural resource policy and Alaska's fiscal crisis. He also teaches. And then Bob is additionally a partner at Jade North, a small Alaskan consulting firm, and specializes in working with mining and other natural resource issues. So Bob's going to talk today for about a half an hour or so on critical minerals, and then we'll have a little bit of time for discussion. So Bob, take it away. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Let me share my screen. And can you all see my screen?
Yep, we can. We can see your whole, there we go.
There.
That's good.
Okay. So uh, so I and my colleague, Professor Brett Watson, has been doing a bunch of research on critical minerals and mining, specifically in Alaska, but I think it's got implications for sort of the broader Arctic. So what I want to do is look at that research because it's described a sort of a framework for how to think about um, critical minerals. And I also probably want to talk about some popular myths, or at least one. So what I'm going to do is define critical minerals a little bit. Then I believe I can predict the future of mining in the Arctic. Uh, and I can tell you what the strategies are for increasing Arctic critical minerals, and then we'll go to the benefits to local communities, and they may or may not be what you think they are. Also, if you have a question, I actually, because of the share, can't see raised hands because of the way I'm sharing the screen. So if somebody has a question, please either break in, raise your hands, or Serena, if you just call on them, then I'll hear it. I'm happy to take questions as we go along. So let's start with defining critical minerals. Critical minerals have really two components. They have to be important for your objective, um, or they have to be hard to get. In other words, susceptible to disruption. So when we think about them, we think about the entire supply chain, mining plus processing. And they have to be, so everybody thinks about, oh yeah, China does all of this. They're a potentially unfriendly country. So it's a potential critical mineral because it's a mineral that's important and China has it all. But you might also think about the US. So the tellurium, for example, is a critical mineral. It's useful for thin wafer solar panels, among other things. And almost all of it is a byproduct of uh, Bigham Copper in uh, outside of Salt Lake City. So it's an American supplier. They're not the some people in Salt Lake aren't unfriendly last I checked. But there are risks, labor strikes, weather, whatever. They might go to a portion of their of their uh, deposit, which doesn't have a lot of tellurium. So if you're dependent on one supplier, it could still be a risk. So let me look at some examples. This was put together. This is from a 2021 USGS, and I hope you can. Can you see my pointer? Um, well, I hope you can. So this axis is minerals that are important to the American economy. This axis is how susceptible they are to disruption. So this column is things that are not very important and aren't very susceptible. Over here It is elements which are both hard to get, that is susceptible to disruption on this axis, and important for our economy. So let me look at just two examples um, of criticality. So here are so cobalt. Cobalt is used for electric batteries. It's pretty needed for the green economy, for our general economy, and it's mined primarily in the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo. It's The Democratic Republic of Congo is relatively friendly to the US, but it's a pretty unstable country. So that's high on disruption and high on that we need it. Gallium is used for integrated circuits, right? China accounts for 99% of the production of low purity gallium. So China is a potentially unfriendly country. So you see how the system works. But there's another way to think about it, and that is that critical minerals depend on what is critical depends on your objection. So to put it a different way, oh, I'm sorry, I wanted also to talk about gold up here. Gold is the perfect non-critical mineral. The USGS rates it high as importance for our economy, but almost every country in the world mines gold, right? So nobody has a corner on the market. So it's a very diverse supply chain. So it's a good example of something that might be critical, but is really not susceptible to disruption. So hopefully that gives you a sense of how critical minerals work. The other thing which I want to emphasize is that criticality is in the eye of the beholder. If you have different objectives, you will have a different list of critical minerals. And I'm going to go for what that means for the Arctic in a minute. So if it's important for the USGS list, initially were elements that were solely important for the economy. DoD has a list that is the elements that are important for defense. Antimony, for example, hardens all their munitions, and it's high up on the DoD list. If you're concerned about energy minerals, you might be concerned about a different list. And of course, the US has a different manufacturing sector than Germany, and China has a different supply chain than the United Kingdom. So if you're a company, you'll have a different view. If you're in a country, we'll have different views. And even within the US, we'll have different views. So these perspectives have resulted in different supply chains or different critical minerals lists. There are a lot of them that are the same. So these are different lists. Department of Defense, Department of Interiors, which was the first lists, then USGS 2002, and etc. European Union and Japan. But let me just show you two differences. Um, Copper is important, but interestingly, it was not on either of the USGS lists 2018 and 2022. Nothing's really changed, but it's now on the list. China has about 60% of the refining capacity for uh, for copper, but it had it in those years. I think actually there was a heavy lobbying effort to get copper on the list because being on the list has some advantages in terms of federal funding. Feldspar is another example. Um, uh, Europe gets 80% of its feldspar from Turkey, but from we get most of ours from within our country. So it's not on our lists, it's on the European Union list. And cobalt is on everybody's list. So depending um, on your perspective, what is critical will differ. So now let's go to the Arctic. I believe I can tell you what's going to be mined in Alaska, and I know, and I think you can do it for the Arctic. It is let me show you the results of some research that we did. And it's really about the structure of mining. And the structure of the mining industry allows you to predict what's going to be mined, unfortunately. So this is the way the industry works. If you have an initial exploration, some of the, oops, I actually want to go back. Some of the projects fall off as you explore. And then you develop a resource estimate, and then you determine whether it's economically mineable, go to permitting and operating. And at each sort of stage gate, projects fall off. But what's also important is from bottom to top, it takes about 20 years. S&P Global estimated about 29 years. We think it's more like 20, but you get the idea. If you find a deposit, you're finding something that may be operating in your children's time. So we looked at uh, a couple of years ago, we looked at every project that had got in Alaska that had gotten an exploration or operating permit within a 5-year period. And on the left is how it broke out. So these 21 projects don't mean that 16 of them will go to significant exploration. It will just depend on what happens. But you can see that, the projects fall out as you go upward. But because it's a 20-year time frame, if you think, well, gee, what's going to be mined in the next 10 years, you're probably up at the top of the pyramid. So if you know what these mines are, you sort of know what is going to be mined in the next decade. And that's true for mining throughout the world, and it's true for mining um, throughout the Arctic. So if you want to know what minerals are going to be mined, you look at the minerals in each one of these uh, stages. So currently, Alaska in the bold are items on the USGS critical minerals list 2025. So Alaska currently is mining gold, zinc, and lead with a very little bit of copper and germanium. In permitting, we have some more silver. This should not be, I'm sorry. There we go. And graphite. And maybe in a couple of years, we'll be mining a little bit more copper, maybe rare earth elements, but you get the idea. You can see um, you can see what's going to be mined by looking or what we have the potential to mine. Certainly not all of these will make it through permitting or economic evaluation. So let's look at the strategies that the US is uh, is is pursuing to try to get more critical minerals through mining and processing. First, they're trying to accelerate minerals in mining, right? There's the Fast 41 process. They're trying to make permitting faster. On the grand scheme of things, in a 20-year process, making permitting faster might shave off 6 months. If you're really lucky, a year, but it's not a huge change in what we're doing. The second thing that you might do, and the US is doing, is subsidize exploration. So the graphite got a grant. Uh, uh, in Alaska, graphite got a grant. There's a copper project that we bought into, the US bought into. There's an antimony project that received a $20 million grant. And so by giving federal money either through buying equity or through a grant process, if you do this, you get the money. We're trying to subsidize the exploration and therefore make it faster. The third thing people seem to want to do is send out geologists to find more deposits. Um, oh, and uh, well, you can find more deposits. If you find a deposit, it's probably 20 years or a decade or whatever it is. It's a long time before it becomes mined. But there's another story that needs to be told about, and that is that many critical minerals are byproducts of traditional economic minerals. That is the traditional economic minerals, gold, copper, and zinc. So let me tell you a couple stories. Um, Zinc is mined in the Red Dog mine in Northwest Alaska. They have a little bit of germanium, and they never told anybody about it I mean, because it wasn't important to them. They sent their zinc to whatever processing facility, ever smelter, gave them best price for zinc. Some of those smelters could separate out germanium, some just wasted it in the slag. So, because germanium was, or because the zinc price so overwhelmed the amount of germanium, they never told anybody, and sometimes they had germanium in their processing, and sometimes they didn't. Um, a similar story you can tell about copper and tellurium. For many years, we were like 60, 70% of, um, 75% of our tellurium or actually, I'm sorry, 95% of our tellurium was imported. Tellurium is used for, I believe, thin wafer solar cells and a few other things. And most of it was imported from Canada, and Canada was frequently thought of as a friendly country. Uh, but in any case, the Bigham Canyon mine, large copper mine outside of Salt Lake City, has tellurium um, in its ore. It's a very, very small part of the ore. Their their economic situation is really determined by copper. Tellurium is whatever, it's rounding error. But they recently installed a uh, a tellurium circuit on their flotation, and now the U.S. imports less than 25% of its tellurium. It's still one, we get our tellurium still from one source, but it is an American source. So the fact that a lot of our critical minerals are byproducts of the economic mainstay of many of our mining potentially makes them low-hanging fruit of critical mineral strategy. And so let me go through the fourth strategy for increasing critical minerals. Oops, actually, I forgot. There we go. I'm going to go back. So if you imagine these are the minerals in the previous slide that we might be able to mine from Alaska. If you could expand the byproducts in the ore, things we don't know about yet, or things we haven't figured out how to get out of the ore, then you have an excellent chance of expanding critical mineral production in the near term. Um, so the University of Alaska Fairbanks has recently got a very large grant to try to explore just that. They're looking at different chemical and metallurgical ways to possibly mine tailings or waste rock or figure out ways to get or byproducts that either are not known or are wasted, uh, produced. So I want to step back for a second, and my slides are slightly out of order. So 70% of worldwide mineral production or expenditures are gold and copper. So if you're a company, it's really gold, copper, maybe zinc or something. You're not really exploring for the small byproducts. It's especially true in the Arctic, because in the Arctic, you really need a large deposit in order to develop the infrastructure to support a mine. I mean, if you're in Nevada, right, you're near power, you're near a road, it's a lot less capital cost to develop a mine. If you're in Alaska, you're probably going to need a road. You're going to need to develop your own power. You're going to need to develop a camp for your workers. They can't commute. They frequently cannot commute. And that's true throughout the Arctic. So what drives the exploration or the things that are likely to be big mines? Gold and copper. Now, many critical minerals are a byproduct of gold and copper, but it means that if you support mining in general, you will likely find many new critical mineral deposits, as opposed to, I mean, going out and looking for a tellurium deposit, if you will. So perhaps a gold rush will be a critical mineral rush. This is a slide we saw. So I want to now talk about what Alaska or the Arctic gets out of critical mineral mining. So typically, you mine the critical minerals, you refine them, you manufacture something. But Alaska, like we don't manufacture F-15s. Um, and those kinds of things are, for the most part, not manufactured in the Arctic. In fact, really, Alaska has essentially no manufacturing, period. We haven't manufactured anything ever. Um, uh, Manufacturing is 2.8% of Alaska's GDP. You wouldn't find that true elsewhere in the country. And the vast majority of our manufacturing is fish processing, which, that critical mineral they need is ice. We also do have a few small oil refiners, but we don't manufacture. And I believe that's true throughout the Arctic. I did some work in Greenland, and they don't make anything in Greenland. Um, and we don't have a smelter. And some places do, but many of them don't. So what do we get out of critical minerals mining? Well, this is an imaginary criticals minerals list for Alaska and the Arctic. It's snarky, right? It's blank, right? We don't use any of these. We possibly could use barite for oil and gas drilling muds. But other than that, most of our locations don't use these. So what do we get out of critical mineral mining? Well, um, I think I beat this idea to death. What we get out of it is what we get from all mining, right? We get jobs, income, and business development. So uh, in Alaska, the Northwest Arctic Borough, something like 50 to 60% of the private wages are paid by the Red Dog Mine. In a federal system like Alaska, the local locality gets a lot of taxes from the mine, and we've been able to spin off a lot of local businesses. So the Red Dog Mine, which is owned by a Native corporation in Alaska, started a number of joint ventures. For example, a catering company to do catering at the mine, and they now do catering at 26 locations in Anchorage. So I do a whole talk about trying to find ways to increase the benefits to a local economy from a mine. But what the Department of Defense gets out of critical minerals is they get out antimony to make bullets and whatever they make, right? They get out rare earth elements for making magnets that make their F-15 lighter. Now we're part of America, so that matters to us. But from a purely sort of selfish economic perspective, what the Arctic gets out of critical minerals mining is what they get out of every mining: jobs, income, taxes, and business development. So our strategies for increasing local benefits are really the strategies you would work with mining, right? Develop local businesses. Uh, this is sort of the residency of metal mining in Alaska. We import a lot of non-residents. Actually, our large mines we import are mostly 70% residents. Includes a lot of placer mines, but there is a lot of um, there's a lot of room for workforce training, for training more drillers, electricians, millwright, construction laborers. Mining is a very high paid is a very the average mining wage in Alaska is about 110,000 a year. It's even throughout the Arctic, it's a very high paid blue collar job. And it's um so anyway, there we go. That's part. So that's what I think we get out of critical minerals. But I do want to work on a myth. Many jurisdictions want secondary processing. So I was doing some work in Greenland. Greenland has a law that says if you're going to mine in Greenland, you have to prove why you can't do secondary processing. Um, and the legislature asked uh, ICER, my research institute, to do some work on critical minerals, and they really were thinking about secondary processing. I don't think secondary processing works very well for many Arctic locations. It's certainly, I'm generalizing, but I want to talk to a little bit about Alaska's disadvantages because I think they're typical for many, but not all Arctic locations. So in Alaska, this graph has Alaska's electricity prices in urban Alaska, really, relative to the US average. We're a high cost environment for the highly energy intensive uses that it is mineral processing. And the US is itself a reasonably high cost location relative to the kinds of places that tend to have smelters. Iceland, for example, has a lot of bauxite smelters, and they're at about 7 to 8 cents per kilowatt hour, and we're about double that. Um, Alaska and many Arctic locations have a higher wage. Um, this is just relative to the US. And unfortunately for Alaska, this won't be true throughout um, everywhere else. But Alaska has a very, very high uh, medical costs. So if one thinks of a smelter, you think it's a very high capital cost in terms of dollars per jobs. Most of that capital money goes elsewhere. Smelters over the last 5 or 6 years have low economic rent. So to put that in English, they haven't been making money. A lot of smelters um, have been losing money. Uh, and if they don't have high profits or high economic rents, that means they're probably not going to be susceptible to a significant amount of taxes. So if you are a government investing in money that you want to go to your citizens, smelters are often a poor choice. Investing in workforce development and other other local intensive strategies work better. So I'm going to stop here and I want to summarize where I think the main points are, and then let's have the discussion. And the first main point is really uh, critical minerals are in the eye of the beholder. It's it is important for your objectives to think about your objective to think about critical minerals. Now in Alaska, a lot of what we're doing is trying to increase mining, so we'll just use the objective. We'll adopt the objective of whoever is our funding or the United States in general. Because for many Arctic regions, critical minerals aren't really related to us. All mining brings similar benefits. I mean, I want to acknowledge that we're part of a larger national and regional economy and that I care. But for just a selfish purpose of what are our critical minerals, really all mining brings the same benefits. Um, we know the likely universe of potential mines for the future, and we may be able to accelerate their development. But one of the ways to expand critical minerals for the regional or national economies is really by looking at byproducts as opposed to looking for new mines. And finally, as you can tell from my rants, I believe the best Arctic strategies are increasing mining in general. And frankly, critical minerals provides a conversation that it's been difficult to have. So in Alaska, our conversation with the national politics has been often, well, you have a great wilderness. Why do you want to ruin it with mining? And I think the notion of critical minerals has been very important in changing the dynamics of that conversation. But in terms of just straight economic work, are uh, increasing training, resident participation. I'll give a shout out to Alaska Resource Education. Increasing local businesses is really the strategy. And I'm supporting mining in general as opposed to finding critical minerals, sort of brings those, uh, increases the strategy or increases benefits to locals. So that is sort of my how I look at critical minerals. Here is my contact information. And for Truth in Advertising, my position at the Research Institute is funded by a grant from Alaska Metal Mines. They give money to UAA, and UAA gets confused and hired me, but my opinions are mine and not theirs. So with that, I'm really ready for questions or discussion. Um, and I haven't. Sure. Oh, th thank you, Miss Ellis. Um, and I haven't been monitoring the chat because I couldn't see it. So if you have a question, uh, you should just let me know. Uh, well,
So
I can't
Bob,
be that interesting. Somebody has to have a question.
hi Bob. Mike Jones here at the Institute of Social and Economic Research at UAA. I'm an economist. Um, I don't think this is the main question, but it is a question. You've sort of outlined a perspective for thinking about disruption potential versus availability. And other than the natural geographic differences that you've outlined, which are really important in considering what is a critical mineral, does the US have an inherently like different perspective of conceptualizing where they want to be 10, 20, 30 years from now from other allies or non-allies? Um, like how
Well,
do we think about horizon scanning differently as a country, and is that good or bad if we can
well,
use those adjectives?
um, w- we've now gone from sort of research-based policy to my personal opinion about what the hell's going on. And so I need to, but I think there are some things that make us different. One is that we're a huge country. So we have a huge mineral endowment. If you're Belgium, you don't have that mineral endowment. If you're Japan, you don't have that mineral endowment because you're just a small place. So we have the ability to look at insourcing our minerals and processing in a way many other countries don't. So the second thing is that um, I think we used to look at minerals as where friend shoring was fine. Like we don't make tellurium in the US. We make it in Canada. Cool. We like Canada, you know. They have good hockey, you know, they're around all those things. They speak English. I have no idea what the US thinks now about Canada. And my guess is that it changes and different agencies think differently. If you're the Department of Defense, you may want stuff more in the US. So, from my perspective, the obvious question about friendshoring versus internal to the US is not resolved and changes. But we do have the ability to think much more about the US than smaller countries do. But in general, the US kind of hates mining and smelters, right? I mean, you propose a smelter for Providence, Rhode Island, everybody would totally fucking hate it. Um, so I don't think this has played out completely. Actually, I will give you an example, however, that it has played out well. We have rare earth minerals, or they're not rare, they're all over the place. And the flagship rare earth mineral mine was in Mountain Pass, California. It's been alternately mining and going out of business for like 20, 40 years. and and for 20 to 40 years they've been shipping all of their rare earth minerals to China. And through partnership and I assume from the federal government, they've finally started a refining process for rare earth minerals in at the Mountain Pass mine, and that's a huge deal. And Australia is doing the same thing. So I see. Hopefully that answers your question, Mike. And Mr. Shaw, I see you got a question.
Hi, Bob. Very interesting talk. I enjoyed it. I was wondering if you could follow up on your comments about secondary processing. You mentioned probably not a very good idea. Was that kind of really Alaska specific, or do you have broader thoughts on the viability of secondary processing in general? Just thought you might dig into that a little deeper.
I think secondary processing, now there are some exceptions, and so I'm making a broad generalization. But when I did some work in Greenland, I was thinking, why would somebody put a smelter in Greenland, right? It's relative unless you could find a deposit big enough to feed the smelter, because smelters tend to require feedstock from all over the place. They rarely are. If you can find a smelter for one mine, and mind you, Bingham Canyon has a copper smelter. It's just really for Bingham Canyon. So it happens. But in general, smelters require cheap power. Cheap power and easy ability to get stuff from everywhere, and often cheap labor and cheap capital. That is usually not characteristics of the Arctic. So unless you had uh, a particular mine or a hydropower that made you cheap energy, or in the case of Iceland, you have geothermal cheap energy. In general, the feeding, the things that makes secondary processing a good idea are frequently not present in the Arctic. The second part is if you had to figure out what are the dollars I as a government are going to invest per worker, secondary processing tends to be very high capital for the number of workers you get.
I guess I apologize. I kind of misunderstood secondary processing. I was thinking of sort of a secondary recovery from mine dumps and that kind of thing. So
Oh, no,
I
no, that's a
misunderstood
great
you.
idea.
You explained that. So yeah,
No, no, no. Secondary, I mean, the flotation, the cyanide circuit, processing from dumps, waste rocks is a totally great idea. And we should do that all over the place if we can. Right? I was really thinking of smelters or hydrometal facilities.
my misunderstanding. But thanks
And,
for clarifying it anyway.
sure.
Bob, you have a question in the comments.
Oh, okay. Whoever is in the comment section, you should just say the question. Did I also look at indigenous peoples' lands and water that suffer from this mining? Um, I think let me give you a couple of answers to that. Um, uh, if there is the question of whether a mine should be permitted in a particular location is specific to that mine and location. And so I'm not trying to say that all mines should be permitted in any location. Um, Mining has the potential to bring a lot of economic benefits. If it brings a lot of economic cost, if you have a good permitting system, it shouldn't be permitted. Um, and so I do think a mine, at least in the U.S. and in many Arctic places, mines aren't permitted unless they have some support from the local facility, or they shouldn't be. I hope that answers your question. And I can't remember who asked it. Um,
Maybe I'll
Mike, you
jump
look
in
like
before, if it's okay, I'll jump in. I have another question too. And then
Sure.
my question was a little bit bigger one. Like obviously Alaska is facing a lot of sort of at a crossroads, right? As the energy oil and natural gas are not as profitable as they used to be, or supplying the economy. Is mining a good option for the future of Alaska's economy? And what are the trade-offs there that, how would it affect tourism, or how would it affect other possible areas for economic development as
Well,
Alaska looks next
I
couple
don't think
decades?
when you look down the road, nothing replaces oil in Alaska, right? Nothing replaces, if you take all the taxes from mining, tourism, and fish, it's rounding error compared to oil and gas. So if you look at both the employment potential and the financial effect on state government, no, nothing replaces oil and gas. If you look at the trade-off between tourism and mining, in general, I don't think we've had a trade-off. Um, Again, speaking back to the previous question, there are mines where you might go, like in for Pebble, a lot of the local people thought, and whether it's true or not, I'll stay agnostic, that mining put too much to risk of fish. But we have not seen mining impact on fish. And really, Red Dog Mine hasn't affected tourism. Fort Knox, Pogo, Greens Creek, none of them have had any effect really one way or the other on tourism or fishing. There is a very healthy fishery in Hawk Inlet outside Greens Creek. The uh, we've not seen those trade-offs. Mining tends to be much in more remote places. And so I think the conversation is not so much between trade-offs between mining, tourism, mining oil and gas, mining whatever. It's really the conversation is between the local community and the mine, or the potential mine, or the potential processing facility. I will. I'm sorry. I will say, in the national conversation, there is a perception that like crows have to carry provisions across all mines, right? That like they can't. That there is um, that mines uh, have had a horrible effect, especially on fish and water quality, and that really comes from our historical practices. But Alaska mines, and I'm happy to rant about it if somebody wants to, have had excellent. They monitor the downstream fish quality in a way better than any other place in the Northern Hemisphere, and they have not found a degradation. And I know, Mike, you had a question, and then there was one in the chat.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. One of the things you really pointed towards was workforce development, and I'm thinking through as mining projects ramp up and then ramp down. Do we have research on mining sector workforce development in terms of like the fluidity of labor, like how folks trained, whether they're in-state labor or hyper local labor, are trained through workforce dev programs and reskill and stay within the same area afterwards versus migrating to remain within the industry? Can we incorporate that in
Well,
how we think about workforce dev?
the Red Dog mine is a unique mine, and we did a little bit of work on that. So, Red Dog, because it is owned by the Nana Corporation, which is a native corporation, hires 55% shareholders. So it has a 55% uh, native hire, including contractors and consultants and all of that. Um, so Matt Berman and I and Jen Schmidt took a 10-year slice, and we followed those people as they worked at Red Dog. And Red Dog is a an enclave, so it's a 2 week on, 2 week off kind of place. And people quit after a while because that's not for everybody. And so our question was, did people who did did people who got a job at Red Dog, one, did they have a greater propensity to leave the local area, right? I now have a good income source. I'm not living in Kivalina anymore. And second, once they quit, did their income go down, right? Were they trained up or did they maintain their high income? With respect to income, we found that the men pretty much retained their income. So that means a couple of things. It could mean they were trained up and they were able to find other jobs. There was also probably some self-selection bias that the people who wanted a high income job at Red Dog still want a high income job when they leave. But I was surprising that the men did not lose very much income after they left Red Dog, which is really part of your question. Women did leave more, did lose. Well, no, women lost a little more income, and the women who didn't work at Red Dog surprisingly got uh, are who we followed increased their income in there just was more opportunity for non-mining income in Alaska. The other thing we found a similar thing for moving out that it didn't really increase men's propensity to leave the area. It did increase women's propensity to leave the area somewhat. But in general, I think that's as close as I can come to answering your question, Mike. And I saw there were other questions in the chat. Uh, Do I know of any cross-border co-management structures for mineral resources? No, not really. Um, uh, no. I mean, there is cross-border in BC, there's cross-border concern of BC mines flowing downstream and affecting Alaska waters. And so there is discussion about that, but I don't know of any co-management structures. Um, uh, and Desiree Poets, why don't you have a long question, and rather than me read it, why don't you just summarize it or make the question in person?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Yeah, sorry for the long question. My question is about I'm not an expert in mining, I'm a political scientist. And one of the things that keep coming up in the literature I'm reviewing is the idea that there is a kind of geological deficit for minerals that are critical to industrial and military production in the US, like manganese and nickel, and that some of these can be found in the Arctic. And in the literature, then there's this kind of connection between like the Arctic then emerging as an increasingly important strategic frontier, but then a lot of an absence of like governance structures and agreements that can support an ecosystems-based management that can balance like indigenous, environmental, and then military and industrial interests, right? So I wanted to ask, like, is this claim about the geological deficit correct? What is the role of the Arctic within that, if that's the case? And then if you have thoughts on what kind of agreements, what kind of governance structures could balance these three different kinds of groups, I suppose, that are coming together, that would be helpful.
Let me talk the second one first. Um, uh, in in Canada, basically mines require an agreement with the First Nations to locate in Indigenous areas. So those agreements turn out to be very similar to impact benefit agreements, where you say, you can mine, but this is what I want out of it. And so they form the structure for doing what you wish. And while I don't believe any place in Canada says if you don't have if you don't have a impact benefit agreement with the First Nations, you will never get a permit. But functionally, it sort of works that way. In many places, there are multiple First Nations, and sort of not all of them get everything, but I believe that provides the structure in Canada. In the U.S., I think we have a couple of structures. Uh, and I'll go through three. First, that we've resolved our indigenous land claims differently than anywhere else in the world, where we actually create native owned land. And so a lot of our deposits are on native owned land, in which case they are the royalty owner. They get to decide whether it's mined or not. So uh, Nana is a corporation for whose shareholders are all native, and they got to decide what they wanted to do. At Calista, it's similar for the Donlin Corporation. So in Alaska, we have native ownership. The second thing we have is local government. And so if you have local government in a native area, that local government is really a reflection of the native voters. Um, in the third, so I was an advisor to, um, this is related to local government. I was an advisor to the Lake and Peninsula Borough where the Pebble Mine, potential Pebble Mine would have been located. And we kind of went, look, no one's going to listen to us about whether to permit the mine or not, right? We're a small change in this international dispute or national dispute. But we passed a socioeconomic ordinance, which I don't believe gave us the ability to veto the mine, but it said we put us at the table for signing an impact benefit agreement for a mine that was not on native land. And so I think local governments and First Nations and native land perform those structures. Now, as to the second part of your question, I forgot what it was. Do we have, I'm not sure I even understood it actually. Do we have a minerals deficit in the Arctic? I mean, we have a minerals deficit worldwide. The reason people go to the Arctic is because it's easier to explore there because it is perceived as more vacant. And I hope I've used those words in a sensitive way. So that would be that's my answer. And by the way, I'm really a fan of impact benefit agreements and finding ways. And actually, I'm going to rant a little bit. So I took a group from Greenland, and they looked at Red Dog, and we really looked at the way they captured socioeconomic benefits. And one of the vice presidents of NANA, not the mining corporation, but the native corporation that owned the ore for Red Dog, gave a speech. And she said, look, all these benefits from Red Dog, they didn't come because there was I'm paraphrasing, they didn't come because a wonderful mining company with a good heart rained benefits on us passive natives. They said, we organized those benefits with the help of an enthusiastic partner. Now, they weren't taking away anything from Tech. Tech was an excellent partner, and she was not denigrating Tech, but she was saying, we, the natives, organized those benefits. And she's right. And it changed the way I think about it. So the school district worked hard to integrate some of the training. They worked hard they did the capital for local businesses. So they said, oh, I see that there is a business that the mine needs, whether it's catering or trucking. We're going to develop that business, and then we'll have the business and be able to hire employees. The Raglan mine in Ontario is very similar. They said, look, you guys, you Falconbridge at the time, you want a mine? Cool. Well, we're going to do these businesses to your mine. And they use those businesses to develop economic benefits. So it's important to think about it for the indigenous organizations to step up and organize the benefits to their local folks. And they don't always do that, frankly. There are places where the native groups are unorganized or have less capability, and they don't do as good a job. But where they can, it really matters. We're at the end of the hour here, and I'm happy to stay on as long as you wish. I don't know if there are any more questions. We're at the end of the hour here in Anchorage. I don't know what hour it is wherever you are. You're probably in many different hours.
Yeah, Bob, thank you very much for this excellent presentation. I think we learned a lot and be able to answer a lot of the questions here across a wide range of topics. So I think this is great. We hopefully will be doing more of these kind of talks, looking at livelihoods and economic development in Alaska going forward. It's certainly a hot topic and one that needs more attention. So thanks again, and thanks to the audience for joining me. I see we had a relatively small but extremely high quality audience. I think we had some
I
great
think so.
members here, and I was glad to see some familiar faces and some new names. So thanks all for joining in, and yeah, I don't know, Serena, if you had
Well,
any final words, or Bob.
I was just going to say thank you for it's been fun to do this, and thank you for all your questions. And if anyone has questions, I put my this will be recorded, and I put my contact information in the chat. Please give me a call, email, carrier pigeon, whatever you wish.
All right, well, thank you very much and take care. Bye.